The sun hadn't fully risen when Elias Whitmore pushed his boat into the water, just as he'd done every single morning for 43 years. The hull groaned with every movement, a sound the people of Port Callahan knew by heart. Some of them, behind his back, called it the ghost boat. It wasn't a kind nickname. Elias's boat looked like it had been assembled by different hands across different decades. Mismatched planks, hardened resin patches, a hull that no longer remembered its own original color. It smelled like salt, old oil, and something deeper, wood that had absorbed the sea for far too long. To anyone walking the pier, it was exactly what it appeared to be, floating junk, held together by nothing more than the stubbornness of an old man who refused to admit he should have given up years ago. Elias was 71. His hands were thick, covered in calluses that told stories he never shared with anyone. He lived alone in a small wooden house a few hundred yards from the harbor, and every morning, rain or shine, he made the same walk to the same dock to take out the same broken boat. The younger fishermen had stopped trying to hide their laughter years ago. "Whitmore, that thing's gonna sink one of these days, and you're gonna go down with it," Dale Pearson shouted from his brand-new aluminum skiff, his friends snickering behind him. Dale ran the most profitable charter business in town, matching black and white boats, sponsorship decals, a fleet that looked like it belonged in a marina brochure. Elias just nodded, the way he always did, and kept walking. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when people respected Elias, back when his catches were the best in the county, back when the older generation understood that a man's boat was an extension of his hands, his patience, his life. But that generation was gone now. What remained were the sons and grandsons, men who measured worth in horsepower and Instagram followers, and to them, Elias Whitmore was a punchline. 3 weeks earlier, someone had posted a video of the boat online. The caption read, "This man's boat is held together by prayer and duct tape LOL." It had over 200,000 views. People from states away commented, laughing at a stranger's life without knowing a single thing about it. Elias didn't own a smartphone, didn't know the video existed, and wouldn't have cared even if he did. Because Elias Whitmore had a secret. And it wasn't one he was ready to tell anyone. The boat wasn't just old. It was inherited, passed down from his father, who had gotten it from a man named Josiah Calloway, a shipwright whose name nobody in town remembered anymore, back in the years just after the war. Elias's father had told him only one thing about it, the night before he died. "Don't ever let this boat go, son. Not for money. Not for anything. There's more in that hull than wood." Elias never understood what his father meant. For decades, he assumed it was sentimentality, an old man's way of saying the boat mattered because of memory, not material worth. So Elias patched it, restitched it, kept it breathing through storm after storm, season after season, never once considering that the wood beneath his hands might be worth more than everyone in Port Callahan combined. That morning, as he rowed out past the breakwater, something felt different in the air. Maybe it was the stillness of the water, unusually calm for early spring. Maybe it was the way the gulls circled, but didn't land. Elias didn't believe in omens. The sea had taught him that faith belonged to instinct, not superstition, but even he noticed the quiet. He didn't know it yet, but he wouldn't be the town joke for much longer. Because parked at the edge of the pier, in a place where no car like it had ever been seen before, sat a matte black Range Rover. Engine off, windows tinted, completely still. A man in a tailored gray coat stepped out, holding nothing but a leather folder and a small magnifying loupe hanging from his neck. He wasn't a tourist. He wasn't a buyer looking for fresh catch. He walked past every polished charter boat in the harbor, past Dale Pearson's gleaming fleet, past boats worth 6 figures, and stopped, without hesitation, directly in front of Elias Whitmore's wreck of a vessel. He crouched down, ran his fingers along the hull's old, cracked grain, and whispered something to himself that no one on the dock could hear. Then he looked up toward the sea, toward the small, weathered boat rowing back to shore, and said quietly to his assistant, "That's it. That's the one we've been looking for." Part 2. The Stranger Arrives. Elias didn't notice the black Range Rover until he was already dragging his boat up onto the sand. His shoulders ached the way they always did by mid-morning, and his mind was on the same things it was always on, mending the starboard patch before the next storm, checking if the bait shop had restocked, nothing more. So when a voice called out behind him, calm and unfamiliar, he nearly didn't turn around. "Excuse me, is this your vessel?" The man standing there didn't look like anyone from Port Callahan. Charcoal gray coat, no fishing boots, no sunburn, no calluses. His hands were soft, manicured, the hands of someone who had never hauled a net in his life. Around his neck hung a small brass loop, the kind jewelers used, swinging slightly as he crouched down beside the hull. "It's mine," Elias said, wiping salt water from his hands onto his pants. "Not much to look at, I know." "On the contrary," the man said, running 2 fingers along a warped seam near the bow. "May I ask who built this?" Elias hesitated. Nobody had asked him that in decades. "Fella named Josiah Calloway. Long dead now. My father got it from him after the war." The man's eyes lit up in a way that made Elias uneasy, not greedy exactly, but hungry, focused, the way a man looks when he's found something he's spent years searching for. He introduced himself as Bertrand Ashworth, a marine antiquities appraiser from Boston. In town, he claimed, on a routine survey of the coastline's historical vessels. Elias almost laughed. Nobody surveyed anything in Port Callahan. There was nothing here worth surveying, unless you counted Dale Pearson's overpriced charter boats or the rusted lobster traps stacked behind the bait shop. "There's nothing historical here, mister," Elias said. "Just an old man and an older boat." But Ashworth wasn't listening anymore. He'd pulled a small flashlight from his coat pocket and was examining the grain along the keel, murmuring measurements to himself, tracing what looked like a faint carved symbol near the stern, one Elias had seen 1,000 times but had never once thought to question. It looked like scratches, weather damage, nothing more. He'd never asked what it meant. His father never explained it either. "Do you know what this is?" Ashworth asked, pointing to the mark. "Nail damage, probably," Elias said. "Boat's older than I am." Ashworth didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood, dusted off his knees, and looked at Elias with the kind of expression people don't wear unless they're carefully choosing their next words. "Mr. Whitmore, I'd like to come back tomorrow, if that's all right. With a colleague. There are a few things about this boat I'd like to document properly." Word spread through Port Callahan by lunchtime, the way it always did in a town where everyone worked the same docks and drank at the same one bar. Dale Pearson found it especially amusing. "They're sending an appraiser for Whitmore's trash heap," he said, loud enough for half the marina to hear, laughing into his beer. "Guy's probably here for insurance fraud. Or maybe he just needs glasses." Others joined in. The mechanics, the bait shop owner, even a few of the older fishermen who used to respect Elias before age and irrelevance caught up with him in their eyes. Nobody in town could imagine that anything valuable could come from something so visibly broken. In their minds, worth was aluminum, chrome, and horsepower, not cracked resin and 40-year-old plywood patches. Elias said nothing. He never did. He went home that evening, sat on his porch, and thought about his father for the first time in a long while, really thought about him, not just the routine memory of grief, but the specific words spoken the night before he passed. There's more in that hull than wood. He'd always assumed it was about memory, about legacy, a father's way of telling his son that some things matter more than their appearance. But now, sitting in the dark with the ocean breathing quietly beyond his yard, Elias wondered, for the first time in over 20 years, if his father had meant something else entirely. He remembered fragments now, pieces he'd buried without realizing it. His father mentioning once that Josiah Calloway hadn't just built boats, he'd built one particular boat for someone important, decades before Elias was even born. He remembered his father refusing an offer once, years ago, from a stranger who'd shown up asking oddly specific questions, almost identical to the ones Ashworth had asked today. His father had turned the man away, without explanation. Elias had forgotten all of it, buried under decades of routine, of grief, of simply surviving. The next morning, Ashworth returned, this time with a second man carrying equipment Elias didn't recognize, a wood-density scanner, a small ultraviolet lamp, a leather case full of tools that looked more suited to a museum than a fishing dock. A small crowd had gathered at a distance, trying not to look like they were watching, but watching all the same. Ashworth knelt by the hull one final time, examined the carved symbol under the ultraviolet light, and went pale. He turned to his colleague and said only 4 words, quiet enough that Elias almost missed them entirely. "It's real. It's confirmed." Then he stood, faced Elias directly, and said the words that would change everything. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to be honest with you. This isn't a routine appraisal. I've been searching for this exact vessel for 11 years. And when I come back tomorrow, I'll be bringing a formal offer." Behind him, the crowd on the dock had gone completely silent. Ashworth returned the next morning exactly as promised, but this time, Port Callahan had never seen anything like it. A second black SUV followed his Range Rover down the narrow coastal road, and behind that, a small moving truck marked with a maritime insurance logo none of the locals recognized. Word had already spread overnight. By 9 a.m., half the town had found some excuse to be near the docks, coffee in hand, nets in need of repair, anything to justify standing close enough to hear. Dale Pearson was there too, arms crossed, still smirking, though something in his posture had changed. The mockery from the day before had softened into something closer to nervous curiosity. Ashworth stepped out first, this time accompanied by an older woman he introduced as Dr. Helena Marsh, a maritime historian from a university research institute. She carried a thin leather folder, the kind that looked like it belonged in a courtroom, not a fishing village. "Mr. Whitmore," Ashworth began, "before we go further, I want to explain exactly what we found, because I imagine none of this makes sense yet." Elias said nothing. He simply nodded, the way he always did, though his heart was pounding harder than it had in years. Dr. Marsh opened her folder and began speaking, her voice calm but deliberate, like someone who had rehearsed this moment many times over. "Your boat's keel and lower hull were built from a wood called lignum vitae, one of the densest, rarest timbers in the world. It was used almost exclusively in the 1800s and early 1900s for specific high-value vessels, primarily because of its resistance to rot and its unusual density. It's virtually impossible to source today. The trees it comes from take centuries to mature, and most surviving old-growth supplies were depleted generations ago." She paused, letting that settle, before continuing. "But that's not what makes this boat remarkable. The mark near your stern, the one you assumed was nail damage, is a shipwright's signature. It belongs to Josiah Calloway, yes, exactly as you said. But Calloway wasn't just a boat builder, Mr. Whitmore. Early in his career, he trained under one of the last apprentices of a famous 19th-century shipwright whose surviving vessels are now part of museum collections and private collector portfolios worldwide. Fewer than a handful of Calloway's original hulls are known to still exist. We believed all of them had been lost to time, until 11 years ago, when a fragment of his personal journal surfaced at an estate sale in Maine, describing a boat he built as a personal favor, using timber salvaged from a decommissioned 1861 clipper ship." Elias felt the ground shift beneath him, though he hadn't moved an inch. "That boat," Ashworth said quietly, "is the one you've been fishing out of for 43 years. A murmur rippled through the small crowd gathered near the dock. Dale Pearson's smirk had entirely disappeared. "There's more," Dr. Marsh continued. "Calloway's journal states he built the boat for a friend, a man he refused to name directly, only referring to him as a good man deserving of good wood. Based on regional records, family names, and the timeline you've described, we believe that man was your grandfather, Mr. Whitmore. Which means this vessel isn't just historically significant, it has a direct, documented family lineage tracing back to its original owner. That kind of provenance is exceptionally rare in the maritime antiquities world. Collectors don't just pay for rarity. They pay for story. And yours, Mr. Whitmore, is airtight." Ashworth stepped forward, holding the leather folder Elias had seen the day before. Inside was a formal letter, embossed, official, the kind of document Elias had never held in his life. "On behalf of a private collector I represent, someone who has spent over a decade searching for confirmed Calloway hulls, I'm authorized to make you a formal offer for this vessel." He turned the folder toward Elias, revealing the number typed cleanly at the bottom of the page. $15 million. For a moment, nobody on the dock made a sound. Not the gulls circling overhead, not the tide lapping gently against the pier, not even Dale Pearson, who stood frozen, beer forgotten in his hand, staring at a boat he had mocked just 2 days earlier. Elias didn't speak right away either. He looked down at his hands, the same calloused, salt-worn hands that had rowed that boat every single morning for over 4 decades, and then back at the hull itself, weathered and cracked, patched together with decades of quiet devotion. He thought of his father's voice again, clearer now than it had been in years. "There's more in that hull than wood." Behind him, he heard someone whisper his name, not mockingly this time, but with something closer to disbelief, maybe even shame. Voices that had laughed at him for years now stood in stunned silence, recalculating everything they thought they knew about the old man and his broken boat. Ashworth extended the folder toward him. "Take your time, Mr. Whitmore. But we need your answer by the end of the week." Elias took the folder in his hands, feeling its weight, though he knew the real weight had nothing to do with paper. He looked out at the sea, the same water he'd fished every single day of his adult life, and, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what he was going to do. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch until well past midnight, the offer letter resting on his knee, untouched, while the tide rolled in and out beyond the tree line exactly as it always had. $15 million. The number didn't feel real. It felt like something that belonged to someone else's life, not the quiet, unremarkable existence he'd built for himself in Port Callahan. By morning, the whole town knew. News like that didn't stay contained, not in a place this small. And almost overnight, the same people who had laughed at him, who had filmed his boat for cheap internet clout, who had called him pathetic behind his back for 40 years, suddenly remembered his name with a strange, new warmth. Dale Pearson was the first to show up at his door. "Elias, hey, listen, about all that stuff before, I was just messing around, you know that, right?" He laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. 15 million, man. That's incredible. Hey, if you ever need advice on, I don't know, boat storage or insurance or anything. Elias simply nodded and closed the door, gently, without anger. He wasn't interested in revenge. He never had been. Others came too, the bait shop owner suddenly reminiscing about, always believing in him, a cousin he hadn't spoken to in a decade calling to reconnect, even the local news reporter asking for an exclusive interview. Elias watched it all unfold with a strange, tired clarity. Money didn't just change opportunities. It rewrote history in people's minds, and he wasn't naive enough to mistake sudden kindness for the real thing. He spent that week doing the only thing that made sense to him. He took the boat out one last time alone before making any decision. He rowed past the breakwater in the pale early light, the same way he had 10,000 mornings before, running his hand along the same warped seam Ashworth had once traced with his fingers. He thought about his father, about Josiah Calloway, about a man he'd never met who had built something meant to last far longer than anyone could have guessed. By Friday, he had his answer. He met Ashworth and Dr. Marsh at the dock, the leather folder now signed and resting in his coat pocket. He'd accepted the offer, not because the money changed how he saw himself, but because he understood, finally, what his father had actually meant all those years ago. There's more in that hull than wood. It was never about the boat staying in the water forever. It was about what it represented: patience, inheritance, quiet dignity, and Elias realized the truest way to honor that wasn't to keep rowing out to sea until his body gave out, but to make sure the story, and the value his father always saw, was finally recognized for what it was. But Elias had one condition written into the sale, one Ashworth's collector agreed to without hesitation: an exact replica of the boat, built using traditional methods, would be constructed and donated to Port Callahan's small maritime museum, a modest building most people in town had forgotten even existed. Alongside it, a plaque would tell the real story, not of a broken old boat that people laughed at, but of a shipwright named Josiah Calloway, a grandfather Elias never got to meet, and a father who spent his whole life protecting something the world hadn't been ready to understand yet. With the remaining funds, Elias didn't buy a mansion or a new fleet of gleaming charter boats. He funded a small trust for local fishing families struggling with rising equipment costs, quiet, unpublicized, the kind of gift that helps people without demanding gratitude in return. He kept his same small house near the harbor. He still walked to the docks every morning, though now it was simply to watch the water, coffee in hand, rather than to fish. Word of what he'd done spread slower than the news of his fortune had, but it spread all the same. And slowly, the way people spoke about him in town began to shift, not because of the $15 million, but because of what he chose to do with it. Months later, a young boy visiting the Maritime Museum with his father stopped in front of the replica boat, staring at the worn, hand-carved detail of the hull. "Why does it look so old and broken, Dad?" the boy asked, tracing the fake weathering with his finger. His father crouched down beside him and pointed to the plaque. "Because sometimes," he said, "the things that look the most broken on the outside are carrying the most value on the inside. You just have to know how to look." And somewhere nearby, sitting quietly on a bench overlooking the harbor, an old fisherman smiled, not because the world had finally seen his worth, but because, for the first time in a long while, someone else finally understood what his father had always tried to teach him.
The end.